Jonathan Drake wasn't your typical CEO. Sure, he had the corner office with the fancy view and the tailored suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But deep down, he felt something was missing. Nexora Tech, the tech giant he'd built from scratch, was thriving on paper. Profits were soaring, stock prices were climbing, and investors couldn't stop praising him. Yet every time Jonathan walked through the halls of his company, there was an invisible wall between him and the people who kept it running. Employees would nod politely when they saw him, but quickly looked away, as if afraid to make eye contact. Boardroom presentations painted rosy pictures of teamwork and innovation, but whispers of low morale and inefficiency reached his ears like a distant storm. Something wasn't right, and Jonathan knew it. He wanted answers, real ones, not the sugar-coated reports handed to him during meetings. One evening, after yet another long day at the office, Jonathan found himself scrolling through old episodes of a reality TV show where CEOs went undercover in their own companies. At first he chuckled at the absurdity of it all. Could pretending to be someone else really give you a glimpse into the truth? But the longer he watched, the more intrigued he became. What if he did the same thing? What if he stepped out of his polished shoes and into the world of his employees? The idea gnawed at him. It was risky, sure. People might recognize him. Or worse, they might think he was out of touch for even trying. But the thought wouldn't leave him alone. If he wanted to fix what was broken, he needed to see things from the ground up. No filters. No assistance shielding him from reality. Just raw, unfiltered truth. The next morning, Jonathan called his most trusted HR manager, someone who'd been with him since the early days of Nexora Tech. "I need your help," he said, leaning forward in his chair. His tone was serious, almost urgent. The HR manager raised an eyebrow, clearly curious. Jonathan explained his plan: to go undercover as a janitor in one of their busiest manufacturing plants for 2 weeks. There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, the HR manager let out a nervous laugh. "Are you serious?" "I've never been more serious," Jonathan replied. They hashed out the details over the next few hours. A fake name, plain clothes, no special treatment. He would blend in completely. The HR manager agreed to keep everything under wraps, ensuring that no one else in the company would know about this experiment. When the big day arrived, Jonathan stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing himself. Gone were the designer, suits, and perfectly styled hair. Instead, he wore a pair of worn-out jeans, a faded t-shirt, and a pair of glasses that made him look like a completely different person. He practiced slouching, softening his voice, and avoiding direct eye contact. When he finally stepped out of his house, he felt both excited and terrified. As he drove to the manufacturing plant, Jonathan couldn't shake off the nerves bubbling in his stomach. What if someone recognized him? What if he messed up and blew his cover? And what exactly would he find once he got there? These questions swirled in his mind as he parked his car far away from the building, just in case anyone happened to glance outside. Walking into the facility for the first time, as John Miller, felt surreal. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal, and the hum of machinery filled the space. Employees bustled around, focused on their tasks. No one paid much attention to the new guy in the cleaning uniform. For now, he was invisible, and that was exactly what he wanted. His supervisor, a gruff man named Tom, gave him a quick rundown of his duties before handing him a mop and pointing toward a hallway. "Start here," Tom said gruffly. "And don't slack off." Jonathan nodded, gripping the mop handle tighter than necessary. This was it, the beginning of his journey into the heart of Nexora Tech. Little did he know, it would change everything he thought he knew about his company and himself. For the rest of the day, Jonathan struggled to keep up. Sweeping floors seemed straightforward enough, but the pace was relentless. Every time he finished one section, another area needed attention. His back ached, his hands were sore, and sweat trickled down his forehead. Still, he pushed through, determined to prove that he could handle the job. As the hours ticked by, he began to notice small things. The way some workers smiled warmly despite their exhaustion, the camaraderie among the cleaning crew, and the quiet determination etched onto their faces. By the end of his shift, Jonathan collapsed onto a bench in the break room, utterly exhausted. But amidst the fatigue, a spark of curiosity ignited within him. Who were these people? What stories lay behind their tired eyes? And what secrets lurked beneath the surface of the company he'd built? With each passing moment, Jonathan realized this experience was going to be far more challenging and revealing than he'd ever imagined. The first few days of Jonathan's undercover stint were a whirlwind of exhaustion, confusion, and unexpected revelations. As John, he quickly learned that being a janitor wasn't just about cleaning, it was about survival. The work was physically demanding, with no time to catch your breath. Floors needed sweeping, trash bins overflowed faster than anyone could empty them, and spills happened at the worst possible moments. Every muscle in his body ached by the end of each shift, but what surprised him most was how much he had to rely on others to get through it. On his second day, a woman who introduced herself as Maria approached him during a break. She carried herself with quiet confidence despite the weariness in her eyes. "You're new here, right?" she asked, handing him a bottle of water. Jonathan nodded, grateful for the gesture. Maria smiled kindly and said, "Don't worry, we'll help you figure things out." Her words struck him. Despite her own heavy workload, she made time to check on someone she barely knew. It was a small act of kindness, but it spoke volumes about the kind of person she was. Maria became an unofficial guide for Jonathan, showing him shortcuts to finish tasks quicker and offering tips on dealing with difficult areas of the facility. Through their conversations, he learned that she was a single mother working double shifts to support her 2 kids. "It's tough, but I don't have a choice," she admitted one evening as they cleaned side by side. "The pay isn't great, but it's stable enough to keep food on the table." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Jonathan could hear the weight behind her words. As the days went on, Jonathan started noticing patterns in the workplace that he'd never considered before. The cleaning crew was severely understaffed, which meant everyone had to pick up extra slack. Breaks were often skipped because there simply weren't enough hands to cover all the work. One afternoon, while scrubbing stubborn grease stains off the floor, Jonathan overheard 2 colleagues talking about how their requests for additional staff had been ignored for months. "They say budgets are tight," one muttered bitterly. "But I bet the executives upstairs aren't skipping lunch breaks." These comments gnawed at Jonathan. He thought back to the countless meetings where department heads presented glowing reports about efficiency and productivity. Not once had anyone mentioned the strain on the cleaning team or the lack of resources. It dawned on him that the polished image of Nexoratech he presented to shareholders was built on the backs of people like Maria and her co-workers, people whose struggles remained invisible unless you looked closely. Despite the challenges, Jonathan also noticed moments of light amidst the chaos. There was a sense of camaraderie among the cleaners that he hadn't expected. They joked around during breaks, shared snacks when someone forgot theirs, and even covered for each other when emergencies arose. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Jonathan watched as the entire team pitched in to clean up a massive spill caused by faulty equipment. No one complained. Instead, they worked together seamlessly, cracking jokes to lighten the mood. He couldn't help but compare this spirit of teamwork to the cold, transactional atmosphere of the executive suites. In those boardrooms, success was measured in numbers, profits, margins, targets. But down here, success seemed to be about something else entirely, looking out for one another. One incident stood out to Jonathan more than anything else. Late one night, as he was mopping near the loading dock, he saw Maria quietly handing cash to another colleague. At first, he assumed it was a loan, but when he overheard their conversation, he realized it was something deeper. The co-worker, a young man with tired eyes, had been struggling to pay bills after his car broke down. Without hesitation, Maria pulled some money from her wallet and pressed it into his hand. "Take it," she insisted. "We'll figure out the rest later." Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just generosity, it was solidarity. These workers didn't have much, yet they still found ways to support each other. It was humbling and eye-opening, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture he'd created at Nexora Tech. For years, he'd prided himself on building a successful company, but now he wondered, what good was success if it came at the expense of the very people who made it possible? By the end of the week, Jonathan's perspective had shifted dramatically. He no longer saw the cleaners as faceless employees performing menial tasks. They were real people with hopes, dreams, and struggles. Their resilience inspired him, but it also filled him with guilt. How had he let things get so bad? Why hadn't he noticed sooner? Still, there were questions lingering in his mind. What else was hiding beneath the surface of this company? Were there bigger issues lurking in the shadows waiting to be uncovered? With each passing day, Jonathan grew more determined to find out. He knew his journey was far from over, but already he could feel the seeds of change beginning to take root within him. As Jonathan settled into his role as John, the cracks in the system became harder to ignore. The longer he worked alongside the cleaning crew, the more he realized that their struggles went beyond long hours and low pay. There was a deeper layer of frustration simmering beneath the surface, issues that no one dared to bring up openly. One evening, while mopping near the break room, Jonathan overheard a heated conversation between two workers. They were speaking in hushed tones, but their anger was palpable. "I'm telling you it's not safe," one of them said, shaking his head. "We've reported it 3 times and nothing changes." The other nodded grimly, adding, "And now they're blaming us for the accidents, like we have any control over this mess." Curiosity got the better of Jonathan, and he leaned closer, pretending to focus on scrubbing a stubborn stain. He caught snippets of their conversation, something about faulty equipment, hazardous chemicals, and supervisors turning a blind eye. His stomach churned. These weren't minor complaints. These were serious safety concerns that could put lives at risk. Later that night, when the facility grew quieter, Jonathan decided to investigate further. He wandered toward the storage area where cleaning supplies were kept, hoping to find some answers. What he discovered left him stunned. Shelves were cluttered with outdated chemical containers, many of which lacked proper labels or safety instructions. Some bottles had cracks, leaking small puddles onto the floor. A quick glance at the inventory log revealed that several items hadn't been restocked in months, forcing workers to make do with whatever they had, even if it meant using products that were potentially dangerous. Jonathan felt a wave of guilt wash over him. As CEO, he'd always prided himself on maintaining high standards for safety and compliance. Yet here he was, standing in front of blatant violations that seemed to contradict everything he claimed to stand for. How had he missed this? More importantly, why hadn't anyone spoken up? The next day, during a rare moment of downtime, Jonathan cautiously broached the topic with Maria. "Hey," he began, trying to sound casual, "what's the deal with those chemicals we use? Seem kind of sketchy." Maria sighed heavily, her expression darkening. "You noticed, huh?" she said, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Yeah, they're not great. We've complained about it before, but nothing ever happens. Instead, they tell us to be more careful." She rolled her eyes, bitterness creeping into her voice. "Like being careful is going to stop a bottle from exploding in your face." Her words hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just negligence, it was reckless endangerment. And yet here was Maria, risking her health every single day without complaint. She wasn't alone either. Many of the cleaners handled these chemicals without gloves or masks because protective gear was either unavailable or locked away in cabinets that required supervisor approval to access. But the problems didn't stop there. Over the next few days, Jonathan uncovered even more troubling patterns. Supervisors routinely singled out certain employees for mistakes, often ignoring systemic issues that caused those errors in the first place. Workers who spoke up about unfair treatment found themselves assigned to the toughest jobs or given fewer hours. It was a culture of fear, where silence was rewarded and dissent punished. One afternoon, while emptying trash bins in the HR department, Jonathan stumbled upon something that sent chills down his spine. Buried beneath piles of discarded paperwork was a memo detailing cost-cutting measures that compromised product quality. According to the document, Cheaper materials had been approved for manufacturing, despite warnings from engineers about potential defects. Even worse, there were hints of falsified reports designed to cover up the truth. Jonathan's hands trembled as he read through the pages. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was outright deception. The implications were staggering. If customers discovered that Nexora Tech was cutting corners, the fallout could destroy the company's reputation overnight. But what shocked him most was the realization that these decisions had likely come from higher-ups, people he trusted to run the business ethically. That night, as he lay awake in bed, Jonathan wrestled with conflicting emotions. Anger bubbled inside him, at the managers who prioritized profits over people, at the executives who turned a blind eye to wrongdoing, and most of all, at himself for failing to see the bigger picture. He thought back to the faces of the cleaners, their resilience, their camaraderie, their quiet determination to keep pushing forward despite everything stacked against them. They deserved better. So much better. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at work with a renewed sense of purpose. He couldn't fix everything overnight, but he could start by listening. During breaks, he struck up conversations with coworkers, gently probing for more information. To his surprise, many of them opened up once they realized he genuinely cared. One worker confided that he'd been denied hazard pay, despite handling toxic substances daily. Another shared how she'd been passed over for promotions multiple times, even though she consistently outperformed her peers. Each story added another layer to the complex web of issues plaguing Nexora Tech. Yet amidst the frustration and disillusionment, Jonathan also saw glimmers of hope. Despite everything, the workers refused to give up. They supported each other, shared resources, and found ways to adapt to impossible circumstances. Their strength inspired him to take action, not just for them, but for the future of the company itself. By the end of the week, Jonathan knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. The weight of what he'd uncovered pressed heavily on his shoulders, urging him to act. But he also understood that change wouldn't come easily. Uncovering the truth was only the first step. The real challenge lay ahead, confronting the people responsible, holding them accountable, and rebuilding trust from the ground up. As he clocked out on Friday evening, Jonathan felt a mix of dread and determination. He still had one more week, undercover, but already he could feel the wheels of transformation beginning to turn. For the first time in years, he saw Nexora Tech not as a machine to be optimized, but as a community to be nurtured. And he vowed to do whatever it took to make things right for everyone. By the second week of his undercover stint, Jonathan had become a familiar face among the cleaning crew. They teased him good-naturedly about his slow pace when mopping, and joked that he'd never make it through a full shift without collapsing. On the surface, things seemed almost normal, but inside, Jonathan was anything but calm. The deeper he dug, the more unsettling truths came to light, and they weren't just about broken equipment or unfair schedules. This wasn't negligence anymore. It was corruption. One evening, while emptying trash bins in the IT department, Jonathan stumbled upon something that stopped him cold. Hidden beneath crumpled papers and discarded coffee cups was a stack of confidential documents marked "Internal Use Only." His heart raced as he flipped through the pages. What he read made his blood boil. It detailed how certain managers had been falsifying reports to hide cost-cutting measures that directly compromised product quality. Customers were being sold defective items and no one outside the inner circle knew about it. The worst part? These decisions weren't coming from some rogue mid-level manager. They were approved at the highest levels. Someone high up in the company, people Jonathan trusted, was signing off on these unethical practices. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had built Nexora Tech to be a beacon of innovation and integrity, but somewhere along the way, greed and complacency had taken over. And now, the company's reputation, and the safety of its customers, was hanging by a thread. Jonathan felt sick to his stomach. For days, he wrestled with what to do. He couldn't exactly march into the CEO's office, his own office, and demand answers, not without blowing his cover. Instead, he decided to test the waters. During breaks, he subtly brought up the issue with coworkers, careful not to reveal too much. "Hey," he said one afternoon, leaning against a wall as he sipped water. "Have you guys ever noticed weird stuff happening with the products we ship out?" At first, no one responded. Then, an older worker named Tom shrugged and muttered, "Yeah, happens all the time. Faulty wiring, bad connections. Stuff breaks within weeks sometimes." Another chimed in, "Yeah, but try telling management that. They don't care unless it costs them money." Jonathan pressed further. "Has anyone tried reporting it?" Tom let out a bitter laugh. "Sure, we've reported it multiple times. Nothing changes. In fact, if you push too hard, they'll find a reason to cut your hours or worse, fire you." The room fell silent after that. Everyone went back to eating their sandwiches or scrolling through their phones, avoiding eye contact. Jonathan could feel the weight of their resignation. These were people who cared enough to speak up, but they'd been beaten down so many times that they'd stopped trying. Their silence wasn't apathy, it was self-preservation. That night, as he drove home, Jonathan replayed the conversation in his head. He thought about Maria, who worked double shifts to provide for her kids, and Tom, who shrugged off dangerous conditions because he didn't think anyone would listen. He thought about the countless others whose voices had been silenced by fear. How could he have let this happen? How could he, as CEO, fail so miserably to protect the very foundation of his company? The next day, Jonathan decided to take a risk. During lunch, he pulled Maria aside. "Can I ask you something?" he said, quietly. She nodded, wiping her hands on her jeans. "If you saw something really wrong, something that could hurt people, what would you do?" Maria frowned, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Depends," she said slowly. "If I thought someone would actually listen, maybe I'd say something. But honestly, most of us have learned to keep our heads down. Too dangerous otherwise." Her honesty stung, but it also gave Jonathan clarity. People weren't staying quiet because they didn't care. They stayed quiet because they didn't trust the system. And why should they? When supervisors ignored complaints and punished whistleblowers, loyalty became a liability. Determined to dig deeper, Jonathan spent the rest of the week observing interactions between workers and management. He noticed how supervisors barked orders without explanation, dismissed concerns with vague promises, and avoided responsibility whenever problems arose. One supervisor in particular stood out, a man named Greg. He strutted around the facility like he owned the place, barking at cleaners for minor infractions while ignoring larger issues like blocked fire exits or leaking pipes. When Jonathan finally mustered the courage to confront Greg about a pile of hazardous waste left unattended near the loading dock, the response was chilling. "Not my problem," Greg snapped. "Take it up with HR if you're so concerned." It was clear that accountability was a foreign concept here. The higher-ups shielded themselves behind layers of bureaucracy, leaving frontline workers to deal with the fallout. Jonathan realized that fixing this wouldn't just require policy changes, it would require a complete cultural overhaul. By the end of the week, Jonathan felt like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Every discovery chipped away at his faith in the company he'd poured his life into building. Yet, amidst the despair, he found a glimmer of hope. The workers themselves were proof that change was possible. Despite everything, they still showed up every day, did their jobs, and looked out for each other. If given the right tools and support, they could help rebuild Nexora Tech from the ground up. On his final day undercover, Jonathan sat in the break room during his last shift, watching the team laugh and joke despite the challenges they faced. For the first time, he truly understood what leadership meant. It wasn't about sitting in a corner office making big decisions. It was about empowering others to succeed. It was about creating a workplace where people felt valued, heard, and safe. As he clocked out for the last time as Jonathan knew his journey was far from over. The real work was just beginning. When Jonathan returned to his role as CEO, he didn't rush into action. Instead, he took a day to sit quietly in his office, reflecting on everything he'd seen and heard during his time undercover. The weight of the revelations pressed heavily on him, but it wasn't just anger or frustration driving him. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the workers who had shown him their resilience, generosity, and humanity, despite the challenges they faced every day. He knew he couldn't fix everything overnight, but he also knew he couldn't wait another moment to start. The next morning, Jonathan called an emergency town hall meeting. Word spread quickly through the company, and employees filed into the auditorium with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. No one could remember the last time the CEO had held such an impromptu gathering. As Jonathan stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. For a brief moment, he scanned the sea of faces, some eager, some skeptical, all waiting to hear what he had to say. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I know this is unusual, but I need to speak with you today, not as your CEO, but as someone who's recently learned a lot about our company from a perspective I never expected." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then, with a deep breath, he revealed the truth. "For the past 2 weeks, I've been working undercover as a janitor in one of our manufacturing plants." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Employees exchanged stunned glances, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Jonathan let the initial shock settle before continuing. "I did this because I wanted to understand what life is really like for the people keeping this company running. What I saw, and what I heard, has changed me forever." He went on to share specific stories from his time undercover, careful not to single anyone out, but painting a vivid picture of the struggles workers faced daily. He talked about Maria, the single mother juggling double shifts to support her family, and Tom, the veteran employee whose concerns about product defects had gone ignored. He described the hazardous chemicals, the outdated equipment, and the culture of fear that prevented people from speaking up. His voice cracked slightly as he admitted, "I failed you. As your leader, I should have known these things. I should have done better." The room was silent now, the kind of silence that comes when people are processing something profound. Some employees nodded in agreement, while others wiped away tears. Jonathan wasn't just apologizing, he was humanizing himself. For the first time, many of them saw him not as a distant figurehead, but as someone willing to step into their shoes and face the harsh realities alongside them. Then came the part everyone had been waiting for. What would he do about it? Jonathan didn't disappoint. "Starting today," he announced, "we're going to make changes, real changes. First, we're increasing wages for all frontline workers. You deserve fair compensation for the hard work you do every day. Second, we're implementing stricter oversight of managerial conduct. If a supervisor mistreats you or ignores your concerns, I want to know about it. Third, we're creating transparent channels for reporting unethical behavior, and I personally guarantee there will be no retaliation." The crowd erupted in applause, louder than Jonathan had ever heard in any corporate meeting. But he wasn't finished. "And finally," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the cheers, "we're launching a full investigation into the cost-cutting measures that have compromised our products. Anyone found guilty of falsifying reports or endangering customers will be held accountable, no exceptions." As he wrapped up his speech, Jonathan made one final promise. "From this point forward, my door is always open. I may not have all the answers, but together, we can rebuild this company into something we're all proud to be part of." Over the following weeks, Jonathan followed through on his promises. Wage increases were rolled out immediately, and new safety protocols were implemented across all facilities. Supervisors underwent mandatory training on ethical leadership, and anonymous reporting systems were set up to ensure workers felt safe voicing their concerns. Most importantly, Jonathan kept his word about transparency. He held regular Q&A sessions where employees could ask him anything, and he responded honestly, even when the questions were tough. But perhaps the most impactful change came from within the workforce itself. Inspired by Jonathan's actions, employees began speaking up more freely. Small groups formed to discuss ideas for improving efficiency and morale, and managers started listening instead of dismissing feedback. Maria, the single mother who had taken Jonathan under her wing during his undercover stint, became a vocal advocate for workplace equality. Her insights helped shape new policies that prioritized work-life balance and career growth opportunities for frontline staff. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about the changes. Some executives grumbled about the costs associated with higher wages and improved safety measures. Others resisted the shift toward greater accountability, fearing it would expose old mistakes. But Jonathan stood firm. "If we're not willing to invest in our people," he told his leadership team, "then we don't deserve to call ourselves a successful company." Slowly but surely, the culture at Nexera Tech began to transform. Morale improved, productivity soared, and turnover rates dropped significantly. Employees who had once felt invisible now felt valued. And though repairing the damage to the company's reputation would take time, Jonathan remained optimistic. By prioritizing integrity and empathy, he believed they could win back not only their customers' trust, but also their own pride in the organization. One evening, as Jonathan left the office late after another long day, he noticed a familiar face waiting by the elevator. It was Maria. She smiled warmly and said, "Just wanted to say thank you for everything. Things are already getting better." Jonathan shook his head humbly. "Thank you," he replied. "None of this would have happened without you and the rest of the team showing me what true strength looks like." As they parted ways, Jonathan felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt confident they were heading in the right direction. Together. Months had passed since Jonathan's undercover journey, and the ripple effects of his actions were undeniable. Nexera Tech was no longer the same company it had been before. The changes weren't just superficial. They ran deep, touching every corner of the organization. Employees who once felt invisible now walked with a sense of purpose. Managers who used to bark orders began listening more than talking. And Jonathan himself had transformed from a distant CEO into someone people genuinely respected. One crisp morning, as Jonathan sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports, he couldn't help but smile at the numbers staring back at him. Productivity was up. Employee satisfaction scores had skyrocketed, and customer complaints about defective products had plummeted. But what made him proudest wasn't the data, it was the stories behind it. Stories of lives being changed, not just within the walls of Nexera Tech, but beyond them. Take Maria, for example. After her promotion to team leader, a role she earned through sheer hard work and dedication, she became a beacon of hope for other workers. She spearheaded initiatives to improve communication between frontline staff and management, ensuring that everyone had a voice. Her confidence grew, and so did her ability to inspire others. During one meeting, she stood up and said, "This company gave me a second chance when I needed it most. Now it's our turn to give back, to each other, to our customers, and to ourselves." Her words resonated deeply with the team. Slowly but surely, the culture shifted. People started looking out for one another in ways they hadn't before. A young worker struggling with childcare found co-workers pooling resources to help cover her expenses during tough times. An older employee nearing retirement took younger colleagues under his wing, teaching them skills that textbooks couldn't provide. These small acts of kindness added up, creating an atmosphere where everyone felt like they belonged. Jonathan noticed these shifts firsthand whenever he visited different departments or attended town hall meetings. He made it a point to stay connected, often walking the floors of manufacturing plants and chatting casually with employees. Some still teased him about his brief stint as John, laughing at how awkwardly he'd handled a mop on his first day. But beneath the jokes was genuine respect. They knew he cared, not because he said so, but because he showed it. Of course, rebuilding trust didn't happen overnight. There were setbacks along the way. One manager resisted the new policies, arguing that transparency would only invite chaos. Another group of executives pushed back against budget increases for safety equipment, claiming it was unnecessary. Jonathan faced these challenges head-on, reminding himself why the changes mattered. "If we're not willing to do the right thing," he told his leadership team during one heated discussion, "then we're no better than the problems we're trying to fix." His unwavering commitment inspired others to follow suit. He made it a point to stay connected, often walking the floors of manufacturing plants and chatting casually with employees. Some still teased him about his brief stint as John, laughing at how awkwardly he'd handled a mop on his first day. But beneath the jokes was genuine respect. They knew he cared, not because he said so, but because he showed it. Even those who initially doubted the reforms eventually came around, seeing firsthand the positive impact they had on morale and performance. The turning point came when a major client praised Nexoratech for its improved product quality and ethical practices. It was proof that doing the right thing wasn't just good for employees, it was good for business too. As months turned into a year, Jonathan began reflecting on his own growth as a leader. Going undercover had taught him lessons he never could have learned in boardrooms or strategy sessions. He realized that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about asking the right questions. It wasn't about commanding respect, it was about earning it. And it certainly wasn't about standing above others, it was about standing beside them. In interviews and public appearances, Jonathan openly shared his experience, hoping to inspire other leaders to take similar steps. "I used to think success was measured by profits and stock prices," he admitted during one talk. "But now I know it's measured by something far greater, the happiness and well-being of the people who make your vision possible. If you lose sight of that, you've lost everything." His candor struck a chord with audiences worldwide. Articles were written about his bold experiment, and industry experts hailed him as a trailblazer. Yet, despite the accolades, Jonathan remained grounded. He knew the real heroes weren't him or the executives. It was the cleaners, assembly line workers, and support staff who kept Nexoratech running day in and day out. One evening, as Jonathan prepared to leave the office, he stopped by the break room. It was late and most employees had already gone home, but there, sitting quietly at a table, was Maria. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Just finishing some paperwork," she explained. "Figured I'd get it done while it's quiet." Jonathan pulled up a chair and joined her. For a while, they talked about everything and nothing: the upcoming holiday season, her kids' school projects, the latest updates on workplace initiatives. Then, after a pause, Maria said softly, "You know, I used to think this job was just a paycheck, something to get me through until something better came along. But now I feel like I'm part of something bigger, like what I do actually matters." Her words stayed with Jonathan long after he left the building that night. They reminded him of why he'd embarked on this journey in the first place, not to save the company, but to rediscover its soul, and in doing so, he'd found his own. Years later, when people asked Jonathan about his greatest achievement, he didn't mention record-breaking profits or prestigious awards. Instead, he talked about the day he stepped into the shoes of a janitor and saw the world through new eyes. That decision, he said, didn't just change Nexoratech, it changed him. It taught him humility, resilience, and the power of leading with heart. And as he looked around at the thriving, compassionate community he'd helped build, Jonathan knew one thing for certain: the best leaders aren't the ones who stand apart. They're the ones who roll up their sleeves and join the fight.